So, hello, my Theosophical friends with the Theosophical Society. Um, it's nice to be with you again. Uh, I think I'll start off by apologizing a little bit for what happened last time. Seems I kind of messed up the timing, so I know many of you came in about halfway through the middle of my talk. I hope at least some of you had the patience to go back and watch it in the recorded version later. And then also Richard was kind enough to post some of the sort of the outline notes that I left and some graphics that I think were of relevance. Excuse me, there we go. Um, so maybe those of you who are interested in my ruminations and notes I'm offering on the science of consciousness, you had a chance to look that stuff over, think about it a little bit, because I'm going to use some of that material from before to springboard a little bit into the topic of conversation today. Uh, and then I'll be doing these periodically and trying to go deeper on various aspects and whatever happens to hit me at a given moment in time. I want to offer the possibility for any of you who would like to correspond with me. You might have questions or comments or observations that you'd like to offer. I do have my own Facebook page. It's under Jeff Curtis. I'm sure there's more than one of us, but I'll be one of the ones in Northern California and probably the only one who lists as a chemistry professor. So you can find me on Facebook, and I'm happy to correspond with any of you about these topics. And as you've sort of gathered by now, I'm a former chemistry professor, but I had a long-standing interest in consciousness and attended a good number of uh, conferences devoted to the topic and read about it, think about it. And so, of course, I'm always happy to talk with anybody about it. Um, Before I jump into the consciousness stuff, I actually wanted to take a little aside today. Back when I was in San Francisco and I would come speak at the lodge frequently, sometimes I would offer sort of a brief science news you can use and observations that I thought might just be of general interest or maybe even utility to friends of the lodge and lodge members. And so what I wanted to bring up here briefly today at the beginning of this talk is a couple of things that have come to my awareness in terms of well-researched and looking very promising, uh, cheap, available, safe supplements people can take in order to protect their health, protect their body, protect their brain. I mean, we all want to do that, right? Um, and I've come aware of two in particular lately that are just looking very interesting. So this is not me saying go out and buy this stuff right now, but it's put this on your radar and think about learning about these two molecular species I'm about to describe a little bit because I think they're very promising. And from what I can tell, they're going to offer health benefits, although they're both still topics of current research. The first one is a molecule called sulfurophane, and it's a molecule that's found in broccoli in high abundance, and particularly broccoli sprouts. Forgive my awkwardness here. This is a little weird to try to get things to square up to a camera on a computer, but I'm doing my best. That's the sulforaphane molecule. And the other thing I'm trying to bring out here is that to go learn about it, oh, there we go, almost square. Uh, One of the particular experts on this who is doing the research and is very good at public outreach and explaining things to people is a woman named Rhonda Patrick. She has a website and a YouTube channel called Found My Fitness. A really great resource of information on lots of things having to do with health and longevity and well-being, much more than just this sulforaphane stuff. But she has a colleague named Jed Fahey. Uh, Actually, he might be a mentor, I'm not sure. Anyway, a coworker, and sometimes they appear together in YouTube videos, and they're particularly information rich and encouraging. So this stuff, the sulforaphane molecule, particularly prevalent in broccoli sprouts, just it inflammation load in the body. It does it to some extent it mimics calorie restriction. You may remember some years ago there was a lot of news about a molecule called resveratrol. It's a molecule in red wine that's thought to be behind some of the health effects of grapes and even in the form of wine, although not necessarily, and purple colored vegetables and fruits. And they activate a molecular mechanism in the body called the sirtuins, which appear to mimic the effects of caloric restriction, but without the hunger part. And it turns out that caloric restriction is a way to extend the lifespan and even the health span, probably more important, of a broad range of organisms. It works in worms, it works in flies, it works in mice, it works in yeast. And the human data, harder to collect, but it's looking good so far. Um, Sulforaphane appears to help activate that pathway, the SIRT1 pathway, they call it, and it has an effect on the mTOR pathway. Um, this is looking to have a strong benefit. And when you trick the body into thinking that it's on caloric restriction, all kinds of good things happen metabolically that end up protecting you in a number of different points of view. It appears to help with blood sugar regulation in mice. I'm not sure that's been proven in people yet. It helps with gut health. There has been tests in vitro, that means in glass, like test tubes, showing anti-cancer effect on human cell line cancers. So keep your eye on sulforaphane. And then if you don't feel like growing broccoli sprouts in your refrigerator, which is evidently not hard to do, I have not tried that. Rhonda Patrick does a nice job telling people how to do that. You can have always a batch of broccoli sprouts growing in your ref to make smoothies with and have a really sound, good science behind it, health food drink. It turns out, and this is work promoted now by her friend Jed Fahey, there is a pretty famous, you might have heard about it, tropical tree called moringa. And people have been eating leaves from this moringa tree forever. Um, this would be a picture of moringa. And I'm not saying anything about this particular brand, although it seems to be a good one, but there's a picture of moringa tree right there. And you can buy this stuff in leaf form, ground up, quite cheap, stable, and then you can put it in pills, which you can see I've been doing, kind of large. Put size, they're horse pills, they're good sized pills. But this is a thing I'm into lately, and I'm trying to learn more about it, assay the effectiveness of it myself to see if it's a good health tonic. The molecule in the moringa plant is also an isothiocyanate. So here's that first molecule I showed you. This part on that end right there is an isothiocyanate group. And in the moringa plant, there is a very similar looking molecular structure. Let's see if I can get this zoomed in. So over here on the left side of the page, or right side of the page, you can see that NCS moiety right there. That is one of the naturally occurring molecular structures in the moringa tree. And by some measures, it looks to be as good as sulforaphane from broccoli. So worth knowing about. Um, along these lines, I'm going to drop one other one on you just for consideration, is a molecule called alpha glutaric acid. This one has been studied in a provisional, not yet conclusive, but very promising data coming in from the Buck Institute, which is an aging institute, has one of their outposts is there in San Francisco, and they do a broad range of research on the health effects of various supplements, and they study all aspects of human aging phenomenon, which is a huge topic of science, of course. And what they find with alpha glutaric acid, once again, dirt cheap, safe stuff. Research it, look at it before you start taking anything. If you're on medications for this or that, you'd probably want to speak to a doctor and actually make sure there's no possible collisions. Read quite a bit. Don't just jump into something because you heard one guy mention it on a website. But learn about alpha glutaric acid. You would find some promising things. And in fact, the Buck Institute has reported a few different signposts of it. For example, it seems that the alpha glutaric acid does good things for bone health. It seems to prolong not just the lifespan, but specifically the health span of mice. Uh, they're working on it, so put it on your list, keep your eye on it. Now, it's certainly true that there are many, many things that are good for mice that don't do anything for us. That is the roadside is littered with sad cases of promising things in mice that turned out not to be so helpful in humans. And yet, there's reasons to think, and now the data is accumulating here, that we may have a hold of something important with these species that I'm telling you about. So, just check them out at your leisure. Um, all right, so back to the topic that we started off on last time. I realize that 30 minutes ticks by pretty fast, so I'm just going to have a chance to jump in now and talk about consciousness in the realm of stuff that I gave you last time, uh, where I laid out a certain number of philosophical underpinnings and I established some terminology. One of the things that I mentioned in passing was my rather extreme skepticism about a concept that is prevalent in the popular literature, and it's wonderfully prevalent and explored in science fiction movies and such. And it's the idea of uploading one's mind into a computer and achieving some sort of a digital immortality. So you'll see the beginnings of my thinking on that in the notes from the last talk. Uh, but to pick up on it here, I wanted to just go over that again a little bit and go a little deeper into why I am not with any particular satisfaction, but just out of reality base, putting a little cold water onto that one. And this is a form of scientific outreach for me. I like to do that when I can find people have been led astray by romantic notions oversold in the media. I'll usually put my hand up and say something. And so this is one of those moments. Um, One of the things I said last time and tried to make a point of is the fact that we don't even have a working definition of consciousness yet. People who work in the field of consciousness and get their grant money to study elements of consciousness aren't able to give you an agreed upon crisp definition of what it is. Okay, so you can see how some of that would be a challenge to program a computer to do it or be it or simulate it or channel it or whatever. It doesn't stop people from talking about it or doing bold research. So Elon Musk has one part of his whole corporate agenda is on an initiative they call Neuralink, which is focused on the brain technology interface at the cellular level. It's very exciting work. It's going to have to do with augmentation of the consciousness you have and or helping to cure disorders. and rescue people from terrible diseases and situations like the locked-in syndrome, where you're all the way awake, but maybe you can't move your body or speak. So it's wonderful work. I'm not trying to be negatory on that at all, but I am trying to calibrate a little bit to how we would think about consciousness in the context of what can happen in a computer. How would we do that? How would we put one in a computer? Well, in order to begin to approach that, I'm going to give you a few more of these visual aids. I hope they're at least as useful as they are frustrating. Um, Here is a picture of sort of a typical neuron. Now, there's many different kinds of neurons. We have sensory neurons, we have motor neurons, we have then the neurons in the brain. Neurons in the brain, there's about somewhere between 80 and 100 billion of them for most people, so that's a lot. And we can think of them as an input-output device. And so here we have the cell body. These little branches are sticking out into the extracellular medium, and they're mating up with other neurons. That's the input end, and the structures are called dendrites. Then we have this axon. That's the wire that, this is hard to do, there we go, the wire part, you might call it. It's actually a very complicated structure with a whole lot of structure, details, organelles, highly dynamic interplay of microtubules and various proteins. And then over here on this side is the output end, where if a nerve impulse gets conducted down the axon, that electric impulse comes to the end and it releases neurotransmitters wrapped up in little sacs called vesicles, which then diffuse across a space and land on the next neuron. Well, hopefully this is familiar to you, and you've seen this stuff at some point along the way in high school or something. What's that all about? I mentioned that the neuron transmission, the potential, is an electrochemical phenomenon or electrochemical wave. So what I've got here is a diagram pulled off the literature that sort of shows a little bit of a cartoon version of what happens as an electrochemical impulse goes down that axon, that wire, from the input end to the output end of a neuron. And this is pretty symbolic. Right in the middle of it, you see the electrochemical perturbation in terms of volts versus time as a wave of impulse shoots down the axon. So what happens, according to physics we don't quite fully understand, is that the neuron body integrates the input that it's getting from the other neurons all around it at that input end. You saw all those branches. It sums up the amount of input that it's getting. Some threshold gets crossed. We do not know the exact nature of that threshold. And the nerve decides to fire a spike, or actually the word we call it is an action potential. And that action potential is a sequence of electrochemical events with sodium ions come flowing in, potassium ions go flowing out, and we get a perturbation of a pre-existing bilayer of ionic concentrations on either side of the membrane. So that thing you see going down the middle of this is the cell membrane, then there's more cytoplasm and another membrane below. So this, just think of it as a rearrangement of ions, this ion flux, and it takes place by virtue of organelles that are embedded in the lipid bilayer membrane that defines that axonal structure, the wire I'm talking about. Some of those are gates, voltage sensitive gates that let sodium ions through, let potassium ions out. Then there are pumps, which after the potential has passed down the line, those pumps will actually set about using metabolic energy in order to reestablish the pre-existing ionic potentials. and then the nerve is ready to fire again. And lots of times nerves will work that way. They'll fire a pulse. They'll go tit 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 tit, and then they'll rest for a while, and then tit tit tit. But the exact nature of the timing of amplitude of those pulses is also not completely well understood. There's a lot we know about it. The laws of electrochemistry that underlie these action potentials were uh, were worked out, and this idea of an electrochemical wave of ion flux across a membrane as the key event. That we call this now the classical action potential, and that was not, I don't want to say dreamed up, but let's say it was conceptualized and modeled with an interlinked set of actually not too horrible looking differential equations that describe in broad form this wave-like structure. And so that thing there in red, that's the action potential and how the voltages across the membrane vary with time as this electrochemical wave goes by. So that was, actually still is in textbooks, the state of the art of our understanding of what nerve impulses are about, how they work, what defines them. Well, we can't exactly predict them in perfect detail, but we can come pretty close with the Hodgkin-Huxley equations that I think we had, should have written this down, but I think they were originally derived and understood in the late 50s and then certainly well proven and dominating the field by the 1960s. And okay, so that's how nerves work. And if we could figure out how to record the status of somebody's nerves everywhere and then instantiate that in a computer that was sophisticated enough to model all of that, maybe we could sort of transport a consciousness from a brain into a computer. Well, there's a bunch of reasons to actually doubt that. And I'm not going to be able to go into all of them here, but I want to note one really big, very interesting one, which is in the last 5 or 6 years, this has all been upended. And that classical Hodgkin-Huxley electrochemical model of the action potential, it hasn't been overturned. It's not like it's not true anymore. It's just that it's now looking like it might be half the picture rather than the whole picture. And what's emerging now, actually quite an interesting story. There's a Scientific American article I read about this in like 2017 or 18. I was looking for it before the talk here. Of course, I couldn't find it, but that's all right. Maybe by next time I'll have it together and I can show you that specific article. But what has been discovered is sort of it's a fun scientific story, actually. In the early 1900s, there was a scientist who had, at that point, they didn't really have any idea what was going on with nerves. They knew it had something to do with electricity because of the work of Michael Faraday going way back, way back, when they learned if you put a battery, a little bit of juice onto a frog's leg, it'll jump. And that was the clue that there's something to do with electricity involved with nerves. But not everybody was sold on that. And so, in terms of understanding neural conduction, there was, in the early 1900s, a hypothesis that it might have something to do with pressure waves, sound, essentially acoustic energy in the nerves. Well, technology progressed, theory progressed, and starting in about 2014 and then blossoming since then has been a lot of work on electromechanical aspect of neuronal conduction. So try to hold this up here. This is I got this from a paper by Satagiri in the Frontiers of Computational Neurochemistry. And he's calling it here a vortex wave, or an electromechanical wave that runs down the axon, concomitant with the electrochemical one. And you see those little weird symbols and boxes and stuff sitting there in the bilayer, those guys. Those look a little bit like the ion pumps and ion channels that were in the last picture, yeah? Well, that's what they're meant to represent. And what's coming clear now is that this pulse of compressional energy, which you could call it a sound wave, it's pretty close to that. There's certain conditions under which it behaves with an interesting quantum property, and then it's more like what we would call a soliton wave. Uh, we're presented now with actually a chicken and egg problem. This whole neuronal structure, this whole of nerves, there is an active argument as to what's first and more important. Does the acoustic, the sound wave essentially cause the electrochemical one to kick off and help carry it, or the other way around? They're somehow mutually reinforcing and mutually tied up with each other. But that's the frontier of the research right now, and things people are trying to figure out. It's probably, I'm going to guess, has something to do with the mysterious and heretofore not really understood triggering event that causes a nerve to decide when it's time to put that potential out to the next nerve and continue the cascade. Now, that is quite a situation. You won't even find this in textbooks, maybe the ones that are coming out this year. I spent a while before this talk trying to find the electromechanical or vortex wave idea of neuronal conduction in a textbook format. None of the ones I found online mentioned it yet. You have to go to the original source literature or a fairly up-to-date place like Scientific American or New Scientist or something like that that sort of downregulates the source literature a step and makes it accessible to a non-specialist, but you can still read it and get a good sense of what's going on. Um, so, gosh, how long have we been talking about being able to model human consciousness in computers and maybe even upload the consciousness? Well, all that talk was missing half of the phenomenon until just recently. And, it's easy to imagine that there might be a few more surprises waiting for us in terms of understanding the full complexity and biophysics of neuronal conduction. It's a very complicated affair, and there are multiple feedback loops involved. Sometimes the neurotransmitters that get released are excitatory. In fact, I think most of the time, but also there's an entire network of inhibitory circuitry and neurotransmitters. A very recent result that I found in this field of the neuronal conduction having to do with sound waves is that under certain circumstances, those waves, if they collide, they don't pass through each other the way that linear behaving waves in an elastic medium will usually pass through each other. But this is a more complicated affair, and perhaps because of the ionic flux attached, when these surface waves collide, they can actually cancel each other out and just go away and be gone. So suddenly you've gone from a case where there is propagating mechanical energy and it gets erased. At least there are some experiments indicating that that's a strong possibility. That's really interesting because what that would mean is that the neuron down the stream could have acoustic energy residing in it that would propagate up the axon and inhibit the firing. Now, I haven't seen a place where anybody's come out and said that. I'm just inferring that as a possibility from the results that I have seen stated in the literature, but it seems like a pretty obvious possibility. So imagine trying to model that with programs in a computer. There's two approaches to trying to model consciousness in a computer. One is to essentially simulate it with really clever programming. Excuse me. Uh, I can see that I've just hit my 30-minute mark, so I will try to wrap this up in the next few minutes. Um, There is one researcher who has got quite far in terms of trying to build neurons on a chip. So actually physically with integrated circuits on chips, simulating the properties of neurons, then link those up. The cheaper, the more obvious approach is to just have a very powerful computer and build within it a virtual network of neurons and other supporting cells, and perhaps the behavior of the microtubules, which are a major constituent of the axons, in order to try to come up with something that would arguably behave as though it were conscious. Um, we are very far from that, uh, especially the upload an individual existing human's consciousness into a computer. Now, that brings me to a whole different idea and kind of a fun thing to think about and talk about, which reaches back into the annals of science fiction a little bit. And I'll just mention this now to get the ball rolling, and then maybe it'll be what I come back to and start on next time. Um, Another way to think about artificial intelligence and how it might take place in a non-biological substrate is simply, well, what if you just make something complicated enough? You just give a piece of silicon or stuff enough feedback loops, enough switches, enough routes of interacting networks that can hold energy, store it, let it go in timed sequences, and figure out a way that there's a sufficiently large combinatorial space of possibility that a consciousness settles into it. Okay, interesting thought. So, just by luck, as a kid, I happened to get exposed to what I think might have been the first ever exploration of this idea. It was a really weird cross between a horror story and a science fiction story made into a film. It was written by Ray Bradbury. I saw this film. I was in junior high school, and it weirded me and at least the other three super nerdy kids in the class totally out when we saw this. So the idea was the phone system. So this is Ray Bradbury writing this in the 1950s, before computers were even much of a thing. So his imagination took him to the idea that the phone system, because of all the wires and all the capacitors and feedback and switching, and at that point it would have included human operators switching. But anyway, somehow all that complexity gave rise to a sufficiently large combinatorial space that it comes awake and is conscious. Now, in Bradbury's story, it comes awake and it decides it really doesn't like this one particular guy. And wherever this guy goes, eventually comes a phone call and he answers it. And there's this weird crackly voice on the other end of the line, and it's saying something like, "I'm gonna get you, sucker." And so the phone system decides to troll this guy really hard. It ends up having a bad ending. I won't go into, but anyway, a heck of an imaginative exploration. Another approach to the same idea came with a novel that I read that was just lovely. It was written by Robert A. Heinlein in 1966. It was called The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. And the scenario there was the story is sort of told through a protagonist, a guy, I forgot his name, but he's the chief programmer for the computer system that is running human civilization's spaceport on the moon. So he knew then that, hey, you're going to have some serious computer power going in order to coordinate and run and control all the environmental stuff and the comings and goings. And obviously, running a moon station is going to take quite a few computers. And so this guy is working at his desk one day, and suddenly something changes, and the computer starts talking to him. And one of the first things it says is hello. And then he finds himself drawn into a conversation with whatever's on the other side of his computer screen. And slowly over time, this really beautiful story develops, and it's quite worth reading if you are at all interested in classic, old school science fiction. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I can recommend it. It's quite a fun treatise on the topic of sort of a if you build it, if you build it complicated enough, something will come, settle into it, take up residence, and use that large combinatorial space in order to have an experience, in order to be like someone, in order to be self-aware. And that to me, at least, it's both inspiring and fun, but it's at least as plausible as uploading a human brain on purpose into a computer that you built for that, because we know so little about what's happening in here. Much less could we record it all, capture the massive state of it, and then put it into a faithfully reproducing or simulating in silico uh, construction that we might come up with. All right, I think we're at the end of the time. I thank you for your attention. I sure wish I could see you all, but I hope you found this interesting. And feel free to find me on Facebook, Jeff Curtis. I'll be the Northern California ex-chemistry professor guy. It won't be that hard. And I will be happy to respond to any questions or field any comments that you might have. And I wish all you folks the best. May all beings be well. Good night.